So previously, we have looked at religion in terms of how it influenced Europeans to go across the Atlantic and settle in North America, and we also have addressed it in terms of specific settlements, like Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Rhode Island. Our plan here today, in our final look at religion in this colonial era, is to address how it affected society and the importance that religion had during this particular era. Now, to colonial Americans, religion is highly influential, and taxes or dues were often paid to a local church. Now, even though he personally wasn't a huge fan of organized religion, Benjamin Franklin did pay his dues to his local Presbyterian minister. Presbyterian is a Protestant faith, just like how we went over Calvinism and Lutheranism and the Anglican Church. Presbyterian is another type of Christianity. Now, specific religions were dominant in different regions. For example, the Puritans dominated Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. The Anglicans were dominant in Virginia, etc. There's numerous examples you could go over. But being the local lifeblood, churches served as the centers of information, but also as places for social gatherings. And they upheld and reinforced existing social hierarchies by assigning pews. A pew being a place where you sit when you go to church. A pew was assigned based on how much money you gave to the church. And positions of power within a church were given to the wealthiest members of the community. Now, at this time, there's going to be friction. There's tension between what are called evangelicals and rational Christians. So EV is evangelical, RAT is rational. Evangelicals disliked the formal ceremonies of worship, meaning, you show up, you sit down, all that stuff. They weren't huge fans of it. And they felt that full membership in churches was declining because religion was losing its intensity. All right, the intensity was going away. On the flip side, the rationalists began to believe in the scientific method. So the evangelicals, they're all about individual experiences. It's spur of the moment. It's not something that's planned. The rationalists view that God created the universe, but they never really interfered with its laws. So when we look at rejection of the supernatural, lightning and thunder was traditionally seen as the anger of the gods. All of a sudden, rationalists are saying, no, this is just nature. This is science. It's not divine anger. So there's two different schools of thought in this colonial era. Now, between the two, the evangelicals were more influential when a series of what we call revivals broke out in the colonial North. And we see revivals, large public meetings for preaching and prayer. Now, these revivals had periodically occurred over the past 6 decades. The idea behind revivals was that salvation could not be earned through necessarily just doing good things. It's not just good deeds and good behavior, but you must submit to God and express hopelessness. So that's where individual transformation comes in, and God's grace only through submission comes into play. And just to kind of backtrack here, spontaneous individual experiences. At these revivals, individuals would all of a sudden experience these awakenings, so to speak, this aha moment where they would express their helplessness, their hopelessness, and submit to God. And these revivals featured sermons that were designed to shock the listeners. And they would attempt to allow listeners to experience something that was ecstatic. This euphoria, this intense experience. So the evangelicals, the people who focus on individual conversion, they start to be more influential. Now, the concept of revivals fits in with an era that becomes known as the Great Awakening. And truthfully, if you look up Great Awakening, you'll see that there are numerous Great Awakenings in American history. This is the first one. Now, the concept of this Great Awakening simply means that revivals move from being local to more regional or more intercolonial because the ministers began to collaborate with each other. They would talk about their methods. The first figure to understand with this Great Awakening is a minister known as Jonathan Edwards. Now, Edwards is from Massachusetts, and he's the first great preacher of the Great Awakening. He was the very typical preacher who would explain what would happen if you did not submit, if you did not achieve salvation. Now, he published an account of God acting through the colonies, and this account was read throughout the colonies and Great Britain. So he believed that there was some type of divine purpose to colonial America. His most famous sermon, you can see the title here. It was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And Jonathan Edwards emphasized that the only thing to save humans from not going into heaven, essentially from going south after they die, was the inexplicable grace of God. But he was very emotional, gave very powerful sermons. He's the first big name to understand. The second is a young Anglican minister named George Whitefield. Whitefield, again, Anglican, Church of England. He read the works of Edwards. He toured England and Wales, and he sought out the poor, the marginalized, the people who were ignored by the Anglican Church. And this is characteristic of the Great Awakening. You emphasize the emotional conversion of the poor, the young, the commoners who traditionally are ignored. People don't always care about what they have to say. Whitefield went after them. Now, he would often preach in streets and parks, not because nobody wanted to hear him, but because so many people wanted to hear him. His crowds were too big for traditional churches. Now, he crossed the Atlantic and toured the colonies for an entire year. He stayed in Philadelphia for one whole week, and he actually earned the respect of the skeptical printer named Benjamin Franklin. Because again, Franklin paid his dues to his local church, even though he wasn't a big fan of organized religion. But Franklin heard Whitefield speak. And I'm paraphrasing, but Franklin had gone to this sermon and he was thinking to himself, I'm not going to give any money, I'm not going to donate. But then by the end of it, he found himself reaching into his pocket, pulling out whatever coins he had to donate to the cause. Franklin even agreed to be the sole publisher and distributor of Whitefield's works. Because just like Jonathan Edwards published his own works, his most famous sermon was published, these sermons were widely read and distributed, and Franklin agreed to publish and sell these works. Although realistically, this might have been more because Franklin was kind of a capitalist. He might have done it for money, but it still speaks to the influential power that Whitefield had. Now, when you look at this movement, it's all about individual experiences, emotional outbursts, a religious movement which causes people to question traditional authority, to question maybe church teachings, or at least what they know, might lead them to question local political systems, and then maybe other political systems, like one that's across the Atlantic Ocean, such as Great Britain. So in a sense, this Great Awakening is one more thing that contributes to an individual American attitude that leads to the American Revolution.